So, hello Android Dev Summit, and welcome to the support library Guts and Glory. My name is Chris Baines, and I'm an engineer on the developer relations team. I've been at Google now for roughly 3 years, always working on support libraries.
And I'm Adam Powell. You may have seen me earlier this morning. I've been at Google for, I guess, 5-6 years now, working on Android UI toolkit and framework.
Right. So when I first started thinking about this talk, it was originally going to be like a deep dive on sort of the internals of sort of some of the support libraries, how we've implemented them, and all that kind of stuff. But then I realized that there's a lot of developers out there that don't actually know some of the basics, how we actually architect it, sort of how you actually use it and why you would use it. So we've come up with these 5 questions of why, around the support library, sort of what it is, why you use it, some of the implications of using it, how, and then sort of bugs. So let's first talk about what it actually is. Yeah, go on.
Oh, sure. So what's included? The support library started out as this very small component. We had this support v4.jar. It was a very simple piece, no resources, just a little bit of code that you could add into your applications, and it provided some extra stuff that you could statically link into your applications to gain more functionality. Over time, it's grown. It's grown into a number of other libraries, so saying the Android support library hasn't really been accurate for several years now. And so we've started growing all these extra features, we've started adding resources, and today this is really an integral part of building any modern Android application. So the rough layout or diagram of how the support libraries look today looks something like this. So off to one side, we have a series of feature libraries that are really pretty standalone. They don't have a whole lot of extra interdependencies. We've got stuff like the new custom tabs library for browsers to use. We have grid layouts. Card view stands on its own. And we have the palette library for extracting information from images. There are probably a few more in there, but this kind of gives you the basic idea. We have the core that is still this basic support v4 library that we had from the very beginning. Now, this really provides a number of API shims for newer APIs that have been added to the platform since a given release. A lot of people who ask, OK, well, why v4? Where does this come from? Well, it comes from what the min SDK level is for your application when you use this library. So we support all the way back to Donut, which, as I understand, still has many users today. Wait, no. So again, we've got some legacy in here, and you'll start to see that in some of this as well. Some of the reasons for the design of the support library and kind of how it's grown very organically. So in addition to API shims for new things, we've got backports of several items. So for example, the fragment library from the fragment system that was introduced in Android 3.0 Honeycomb is available to all applications even before that. And again, we have a large number of users on devices that old these days. However, the fragment support library has kept up to date with newer features such as embedded child fragments and similar features. We've got other standalone features, things like ViewPager. You'll recognize ViewPager from any sort of tabbed UI across Android these days. This component doesn't actually have a representation in the Android framework as a public API. Instead, this just exists as part of the support library that you can use anywhere. And this is a feature that's become very stable over time. On top of the support v4 libraries and sort of the infrastructural shims that they support, you've got items like Recycler View. So you just sat through a wonderful presentation on Recycler View here. Recycler View internally uses a lot of those API shims to access functionality that may or may not be available under the hood. It's this sort of layering that we've really tried to set up across some of the support libraries so far. Going a step further, we have some polyfills. So we have backported large chunks of the UI toolkit as it's advanced forward in terms of material design and even Holo before it, in the form of the AppCompat library. Now, this really tries to track a lot of the other framework changes that have had, so that it just sort of fills in any missing functionality in older versions of the platform. Now, with that as a base, we've built some other components that sit on top of these layers. We have things like Media Router, which services all of the cast endpoints for talking to Chromecast devices and similar. We have the design libraries, which provide all sorts of modern material design components on top of the basis that AppCompat has created. We have a preferences system, which updates the preferences system that you know and love from the Android framework to also work on other form factors. And we've got the Leanback library, which allows you to create great 10-foot UI experiences. So why do we have all this? Well, part of this was about the release cycle. So we wanted to be able to do some unbundled releases and get more of these features out to developers sooner. We also wanted to be able to get bug fixes out on an app developer's schedule, not on a platform release schedule. And we also wanted to make new features available kind of in between these releases as well. So in this case, static libraries really were the tool to use here. You as the app developer are in ultimate control of when you update this code. However, that also means that you don't automatically take advantage of updates and bug fixes that are released perhaps off cadence from your own app releases. So it's double-edged.
Yeah, so hopefully over the past sort of couple of releases, you've seen that we've been doing more and more interim releases. So previously, the support library was always tied to a platform release. But since 21, I think was the last one, we've been doing more and more interim releases. And that's because the support libraries have become more and more important to you guys, which means that we need to start fixing things quicker. And we know that.
So Recycler View is one example of the components that we've got in here. Again, we just sat through a whole talk based on that alone. We've got dataset windowing within a larger data set. Improves upon similar framework components such as list view, and it also supports nested scrolling by way of the v4 shim APIs that we've made available. So just a quick run through since you just saw a bunch of this content. Plug the talk that was here before. If you missed it, go ahead and go watch the video. Animations are a prime example of something that we were able to offer in Recycler View that we couldn't necessarily backport to existing versions of list view. Being able to make this available to previous platform versions was one of the reasons Recycler View was developed in the manner that it was. It's pluggable, so you can provide your own components and pieces, layout managers, item decorations, treatment of recycled view pools, all the complexity that you may want to add to this or not. And it really tries to enforce some better practices that built up around something like list view over time. AppCompat.
AppCompat. So AppCompat, yeah. So this is the thing I've been working on since I joined Google. It's my starter project, actually. And it's generally trying to be a massive polyfill over the UI toolkit. Now, as the UI toolkit has changed over the different platform releases, we tried to keep AppCompat up to date. So it originally started out as a action bar backport. Now, I'm sure you were all using the action bar Sherlock at the time. And many question why we actually released Action Bar Compat, which was this. And now the reason why we did that is so that we can give you what it is today. So that's a base that we built, and now we've kept up to date the framework. And so yeah, it backports framework features. But one thing you'll know, it goes no further. It will never add new features that aren't in the framework. And its goal is to always to stay up with the framework, stay up to date with the framework. We may be a release or two behind, but with those interim releases that we talked about earlier, we will never be too far. So there are three main things which I think AppCompat gives you. The first is its themes. It gives you one theme to extend or use, which works and looks mostly the same across all different API levels. So that's including Gingerbread, through to Hollow, through to Material. It gives you one theme to use. Second is Toolbar. Now, as we said earlier, we give you the action bar in API 11, but it was always this black box. Like, you couldn't really control it, you couldn't animate it, you never really had much control over it. So Toolbar is the manifestation of that as an actual widget. You control it from top to bottom, where it is in your hierarchy, you can animate it, you can scroll it, you can do what we want with it. And secondly, tinting. It's probably the wrong title of this, but in theme.material, we give you these new attributes which can control the look and feel of your app for its colors and stuff. Now, AppCompat tries to do that as well, using its own attributes. There are certain things which, before Lollipop, don't quite work. So it's really important to test and make sure it does. So we'll move on to the design library, which is kind of the layer above AppCompat, which means that it goes beyond the framework. Anything in the design library is stuff that isn't in the framework. It's a UI feature library, which tries to implement material design interactions. So the stuff that we think is stable and that are good interactions to use.
Yeah, more specifically, the design library offers us an outlet for all of these components that may have sort of a fashion life cycle associated with them. You can probably think of a number of components over the years that we've introduced that maybe haven't stood the test of time. Some of these components in the Android framework today have been marked as deprecated, such as android.widget.gallery, and some similar things that you may be able to recall. This basically gives us an ability to still iterate, follow some of these other trends as they move forward, but still give you something that you can reasonably rely on.
So there's 4 things which I think Design Library gives you, the high-value stuff, basically. Floating action button is probably the most ubiquitous one. It's the thing where you think material design, it's that circular button. Now, there are some nuances of how it's sort of the UX spec is done, which floating action button actually sort of does for you.
It's just an image button, though, right? I mean, how hard could it be?
Well, it's just, yeah, exactly. The shadow's really easy. So there's, going on that, actually. So one thing you probably don't notice is that there's actually a small little sheen on the fab. It took me about a week to implement. So yeah, to actually use it, it's really easy. You just put this into your layout, and you can change the icon which is displayed. There's some other stuff you can do as well. But floating action button handles certain stuff like it has the correct show and hide animation. It handles itself nicely with snack bar. There's quite a lot of functionality built straight into it. Secondly is navigation view. Now, the material design is quite prescriptive over how the side nav is displayed and how it's laid out. Now, we've tried to give you this sort of stock off-the-shelf component, which you can drag straight into draw layout, and it just works. Here's what it is in your layout. It's pretty easy. But there's 2 things you should look at. The first is header layout. So that is the sort of header. It's a reference to another layout which will be displayed as a header. Usually, it'll be like something like an account switcher or some kind of branding. The second thing is menu. So that is actually what gets populated into the navigation view. Now, we're using menu because it's something that you've already used. It's been there since API 1. You've probably used it for options menu, all that kind of stuff. So you know exactly how to use it.
More specifically, it's declarative, so it's easy for tools to access.
Exactly. Snapbar, which is the kind of new way to show temporary information. It's a bit different to Toast in that it allows you to add an action to it, and also it's swipeable. There's a small thing here where you can see that the fab moves up as the snapbar comes in, and that's all inbuilt functionality. That just happens automatically. So yeah. And then lastly, there's tab layout. Now, there are 2 types of tabs, which is quite a mouthful. So there's fixed tabs on the left, where each tab takes the same amount of space. Now, they're great for when you have like a small number of tabs. So you know there's going to be 3 or 4. They're going to fit. On the right, you've got scrollable. So they're for times when you have like an unknown number. So using your layout, again, it's just tab layout. The attribute here to look at is tab mode, and you can switch between scrollable and fixed. Now that we know that most people using tab layout are going to use it with a view pager, so we have this method set up with view pager, which handles all of it for you. It populates the tab layout, it sets the listeners so they all interact together. Works quite nicely.
All right. So we've added some other things more recently as well. Inspired by Android Wear and really trying to get a lot of other proportional layouts on a very small screen. We've got several variants on existing layout managers that have been in the framework for a while that now accept percentages as well as the standard measurements that you know and love. So we've got frame layout and relative layout here, and you can define sizes of elements as a percentage of their parent rather than just as wrap content or specific sizes. This differs from weight in a few important ways, just in terms of how it adds up over time as elements come and go. So weight, it's oftentimes a little bit awkward to go ahead and sort of remeasure and rethink how some of this stuff would lay out, whereas the percentage makes it much easier to express in line. So this adds a couple of specific layout params attributes that you'll want to know about. They work about how they sound like they should from the description. So we have some gotchas in the support libraries.
No.
No, never. So when you're building against the support libraries, the library major version number really is the minimum compile SDK version that you need to declare. This is something that trips up a number of developers, and this is something that isn't always clear just from the outset. We get a lot of variance on this question as people move over to a new release of the support libraries. Hey, my build's broken, why? This is probably why. So as we increment the library major version number, you also need to compile against the latest SDK in addition to that.
Have we just leaked API 24?
There's going to be an API 24, everybody. You heard it here first. So this is another number that you're probably familiar with. Not only is it a handy-dandy power of 2, It's also the DEX method reference limit. So how big are all these support libraries anyway? Well, AppCompat is kind of a few in terms of that method. V4 library, okay, well, that's a little bit bigger. Design library, and we recycler view too. Okay, well, that's kind of a big number. That's also a lot to ask developers to devote to some of these components.
One thing to notice there is that that's a theoretical maximum. There will actually be some double counting in that number as well. Just because like those support libraries will be referencing framework methods. Now, if you use those same methods, they won't be counted twice.
Right, so there's a little bit of folding that happens here, but it also starts incrementing the count pretty quickly. So many of you have probably already figured out that you can use handy-dandy ProGuard tools to take care of some of this problem. You can set minify enabled to true across the Android.support package, and well, that's a little bit more manageable than what we had before. Of course, the more of the support libraries you use, the more you're going to be pulling in. The Cheese Square example app, so far, we were able to cut down over half of that, and it still uses a fair number of the pieces of functionality available.
Yeah, one thing to know there is that that is the very basic ProGuard config. Like, you could go further into that and start stripping more stuff.
That's right. So of course, ProGuard isn't optimal, especially when you're in a sort of very tight modify, compile, debug, run, test type of development cycle. At that point, you'll have plenty of time to check your favorite social media sites before that gets done and installs on your device. However, I think that there was this really cool demo earlier this morning that might be able to help out with some of that. So now that we have the new features in Studio to shorten that cycle, that'll help out with this as well. So whereas before, it wasn't really something that you wanted to do to enable this type of stripping just straight out of the box on every build, now it's at least a little bit more of a palatable option if your application's starting to get large.
So one thing that, one sort of strategy I've heard from sort of you guys really, is that most engineers will use multi-dex for day-to-day development, just because it's quicker than ProGuard for the debug build. And then when you actually want to release, that's when you turn on ProGuard. So that tends to be a strategy which sounds like it should work well.
Yeah, I mean, it comes along with other costs as well, like especially if you're doing any sort of optimization of startup time, that comes with some other costs as well. Anyway, there's a lot of trade-offs, but there are options available, so don't think that you're stuck when you run up against some of these problems.
And one thing to actually say that we know that this is a problem. Like, we know that support v4 is quite large, and we are thinking of ways to improve the situation, like we know.
The short version of it is we're going to delete a lot of code. Okay. So how are we going to delete a lot of code? No, how do we use?
How do we use it? So I'm guessing we're all using Gradle these days, and so we just add the library to your dependency. But one thing I've seen sort of in quite a lot of open source apps is that you'll be using more than one support library, and then you'll forget to update the version number on one of them, and then it will get out of sync, and then bad stuff can happen. So it's just a small tip, I mean, I'm sure most of you are using this anyway, is that you can extract the version number into a variable in your Gradle file, and then you can use it, you can reference it in that dependency line. So after that, it actually clicks, there we go. Your dependencies come this. What it means is that whenever you want to update your version number, when you want to like, move up to the new version of the support library, you can change this one line and it works for everything else. It means you're going to hit less problems, and also it's less time manually editing Gradle files.
Which, you know, everyone wants to spend less time there. Okay, so bugs in the support library.
There's never any bugs.
No.
So, what do you want to say about this? We know there are bugs. There are always going to be bugs in the support library. And just because that, from the nature of what it is, we have to support all the way back to API version 4 and support v4, AppCompat v7, all the others. So there are sometimes going to be bugs, we know that. So we are very grateful for when you actually submit stuff. Hopefully you'll see that we're pretty hot on it. Like, we will assign stuff pretty quickly. Even though we don't release as quickly as what some of you would like, we know that it's something that we should improve.
Right. And this is something where we've got a number of things in progress. We have heard you. We got a lot of feedback from the last couple of releases that we had that were maybe a little bit rougher than we would have preferred. And we're working on it. So this is something that if there's some more stuff that we miss, please submit them. This is not just a black box that you're going to throw reports down into and we won't read. We do keep an eye on these things.
One thing to know as well, actually, when you open a bug on AOSP, there's a little box at the top which allows you to change what type of bug. When you select support library, it will come with a template. Please follow the template. For things like design library, where a lot of the bugs tend to be with scrolling, you trying to describe it in text isn't going to really, it doesn't help me. You giving me a screen record of how it actually looks is much easier for me to actually debug and work out what's happening. It just saves me time and it saves you guys time as well.
All right. So we have saved plenty of time because support library is one of those topics that everybody has something to talk about for. So we'd like to open up the floor to Q&A.
Maybe not. No, go on.
We've got one over here and one over here. Do we have the mics up?
Where's the mic?
OK, they're coming.
Hi, so we have the very nice floating action button in this design library.
Yeah.
Is the floating action button menu coming soon?
Do you mean like the speed dial, like inbox style?
Sorry?
Do you mean like speed dial, the inbox style of when it pops up with a little floating badge?
Yeah, the plus that changes into a cross and pops up the items.
Do you want something?
The design team is playing around with a bunch of other ideas around this. One of the things that tends to happen, especially with the design library, is, well, let me back up for a second. We mentioned before that when we put a component into the AOSP support libraries, we really want it to be something that we're fully willing to endorse this particular pattern. A lot of the Google applications, such as Inbox, have done a bunch of their own explorations down one path or another that kind of extend some of these basic ideas so far. The design team hasn't been willing to entirely put their stamp of approval on this to the point of saying, hey, we want to see this in every Android app, and we think that this and all of the details behind this pattern are something that we want to really standardize on and give to developers as this sort of full story for the platform. So as soon as that happens, you'll see this showing up in the design support library.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at this material design spec, it doesn't really mention the speed dial anymore. It mentions, it's quite general, like transitions, I think they call it. So we are looking at writing some the transitions between things, but it's still early days. We're not there yet.
I would say watch this space.
Yeah.
Got one up front, or another over?
What's your policy on trying to resolve, or if you want to try to resolve crashes that come up from manufacturers such as Samsung or HTC? That's
My favorite topic.
So I believe what it is that you're referring to is that on some devices that are out there, there is a potentially older version of support libraries that are on the default class path. This is something that we're working with manufacturers on to try and help with this. And in the meantime, we're going to offer some other workarounds that'll hopefully make your lives as developers a little bit easier.
With like the Gradle build tool or some of the other libraries in there, they're in like a Maven repo online or anything else. And the support libraries, you have to download it to your local machine, and trying to keep that up to date has been very frustrating and hard at times. Is there a way to like move that to a centralized repo that we can just get access to, or?
So I think that's probably a good question for some of the Android tools team. They'll be outside available at probably the kiosk that says Android Studio. Also probably a great question to bring up at like the fireside chat around tools as well.
Are there any plans of bringing animations to grid view similar to recycler view?
To grid view similar to a recycler view. I believe that the plan on that is to build more grid layout managers for recycler view so that it inherits all the animation capabilities that recycler view has. Grid view right now is based on the same internals that list view is within the framework. And for all the same reasons, it's basically hit its complexity budget in terms of this. There's a number of tactics that you can use to try to do similar animations in grid view and in list view, and all of them end up having some pretty drastic downsides to them in terms of what you're able to do from from application code or from something like a support library in there. So we would really suggest using a Recycler View Layout Manager meant to lay out within a grid to get that type of functionality.
Yeah, there's already two, off the top of my head, there's already two grid layout managers bundled with Recycler View. There's Grid Layout Manager and there's Staggered Grid Layout Manager. And they both do slightly different things in terms of how they deal with spacing. But yeah, they're already there, so you can have a look.
So Recycler View is its own standalone component and has its own standalone library, whereas, like you mentioned before, something like ViewPager, which doesn't exist in the framework but is just part of the core. In the future, can we expect to see things like that that aren't in the framework but are standalone in their own libraries?
You also saw this with grid layout as an example of something else that kind of sat on its own. Most of the reason for this is kind of historical. We started off with the V4 support library, and due to some limitations in our internal build tools at the time, this was all like pre-Gradle, pre-AARs, things like that, we couldn't have resources in there. So we had a bunch of other pieces. I mean, this is part of the reason why you can't do nice things with attributes in your layouts for things like ViewPager, whereas if we were doing that today, we would totally add all these additional pieces. So now we basically have this issue of like keeping source compatibility with a lot of current developers' builds and so on and so forth around that. I think that the design library approach is probably the one to expect with things with a forward-facing UI component. Recycler View is a little bit unique in that it's basically a framework for writing list views. And to that end, it kind of sits on its own just because it's a little bit more infrastructural instead of the full out-of-the-box turnkey component. I would probably expect to see some things based on Recycler View start making their way into some other libraries that kind of sit on that layer of abstraction above.
I mean, Leanback already makes huge use of Recycler View.
That's a perfect example, yeah.
Hi. Any plans or suggestions for doing animations in ViewPagers? Specifically, like remove and add animations there?
That's also a great question. So I've kind of had this idea kicking around in my head for a while that at some point ViewPager would be updated into sort of the new world, into kind of a new ViewPager 2 based on top of Recycler View. In which case, again, just like with grid views, you'd kind of inherit a lot of that functionality for free. We haven't gotten around to doing that sort of thing yet, but if you were feeling so inclined to build something kind of like that and you feel like you want to take a crack at it, that's probably how I would start. In terms of ViewPager's current system, what types of animations are you thinking of? I mean, we do have a little bit of capability in there around the lines of like page transformers. And that allows you to get kind of the what we always called the cafeteria tray style that we used to use in the paged launcher all apps a couple of versions ago. You can also use it to get quite a few other effects as you're paging through things. So what were you thinking of more specifically? Oh, sorry, they took your mic.
Specifically, actually add and remove animations, so removing pages from it, and also being, maybe this is a little bit too far out, but
Be far out, come on.
being able to fling multiple pages but land on page boundaries.
I see. Yeah, this is, huh?
Sounds like gallery.
Yeah, it actually does. So we have this wonderful deprecated widget in the framework that you might take a look at. No. So again, this is one of those features that's kind of a well-known feature request for Recycler View in general, which is being able to stop on item detent boundaries. This is something that a number of teams have wanted for a number of other types of applications, but the core piece of functionality remains the same for all of it. It's just kind of like spin it around along the other axis of scrolling and make the item sizes either uniform or not. It all kind of boils down to the same thing in the end. So that's something that we're definitely thinking about in terms of Recycler View as an infrastructure component.
Anyone else?
Over here.
Hello. Could we expect some of the material spec components to be added anytime soon, something like the bottom sheet?
Maybe.
Yes.
So bottom sheet's a weird one in that there's two types of bottom sheets. From what I remember from the spec, they're not too prescriptive over what the content is. It's more the interaction. So the thing that we'll be concentrating on is the interaction, because that's probably the most difficult thing to get right. So that might be coming soon.
Yeah, so Chris is being very cagey. Basically, I would say that in the fullness of time, I think it's our ideal that the design library would reflect the contents of the material design spec.
The important bits, the stuff you're going to use.
So the parts we like? Or-
Yeah, maybe. Or the stuff that we want people to use.
Yes. Which, again,
All of it, I guess. Okay, let's shut up.
Hi, I'm wondering if there are any plans for like supporting font features in the support library. So on newer versions of Android, there's the Roboto font. So for example, in the navigation view, for example, in the spec, it's supposed to be a medium font, which does not exist on older API levels. So or like in the toolbar. So are there any plans for supporting fonts and that kind of thing?
you went to Rafe's talk earlier, didn't you? On the typography? Yeah. So yeah, that was a good piece of feedback, especially from within that talk's Q&A as well. So thank you for that. We'll try and make that a little bit more extensible, at least so that you can get those sorts of things plumbed down into those widgets that do sort of generate their own items that contain text. I think that's a great piece of feedback. One of the other things that some people found pretty early after the introduction of the data binding system, and this may not apply necessarily to like the navigation view or toolbar issues that you're bringing forth here, but with regard to other font features, people found that they could use a couple little snippets of code within the data binding system to apply some pretty interesting font tricks to existing views. So I would probably use your favorite search engine and try and dig up some of those posts and take a look at some of the stuff that they've done, because it really does help to fill some of those gaps around font features in particular. Got one back here.
I really like the nested scrolling concept that we're seeing now. So my question is, do you have any tips or and tricks on developing, debugging, testing like code that's related to gesture handling? Because there was a bug in nested scrolling, I think, in Recycler View, and that was really difficult to debug.
If only the man who wrote nested scrolling was here.
Oh, now you're just reusing Chet's jokes.
I know, it's good.
So which bug are you referring to? I mean, I guess, yes, it can definitely be a little bit brain bending to deal with the nested scrolling stuff. It's part of the reason why we're trying to make it a little bit more turnkey in general, just with some of the components that are part of the design library and so on and so forth. So what were some of the specific issues that you ran into, and we can try and take that into account for the future?
Oh, the example was it was when you're fleeing the recycler view, and I had another I forgot the name of it, but basically implementing like parallax effect, for example, and the fleeing was actually the fleeing that was the velocity that was sent to the view that's being parallax animated was the wrong direction, things like that. And it was like when you scroll when you fling it, it was like it was moving along nicely, and then it just went to the
bounces back the completely opposite direction.
Yeah, we know.
You see it in the cheese square. I haven't tried the latest version of Recycler View or the support v7 libraries, but supposedly it's fixed. I haven't tried it yet, though.
We know the issue.
So I'm just wondering, like, do you have any tips and tricks in terms of when you develop this kind of thing?
So the difficulty with debugging this kind of stuff is when you start moving the view at the same time. So that's when it gets a bit more difficult, which is why this particular bug has been quite hard to track down. We think we're there now. We think we're there. Basically,
Chris is being cagey about it, but yes, we were actually looking at exactly this problem last week.
Yes.
This bug in particular. So yes, we're sorry.
That's one of the things with nested scrolling, actually, because I mean the API is great, but each view which implements it does it slightly differently. So that's one of the reasons why these kind of issues sort of crop up.
I mean, some of this just kind of owes to the way that Recycler View is a really great example of this. I mean, if one piece of scrolling code covered every possible use case, then we would have been done with scroll view. So Recycler View and other things scroll by completely different mechanisms for one reason or another, and it ends up leading to bugs that hopefully you never see externally. And unfortunately, this one made it out.
Anyone else? No. I think we'll
No
call
more?
it.
Going once, going twice? OK.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.